Joanne Hughes from Archaeological Management Services is going to talk about determining significance of effect. So I'll let you go ahead there, Joanne.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks everyone for the previous talks. So, as Ellen said, I'm here this morning to talk a bit about determining the significance of effect. We'll be discussing how to rate importance, the magnitude of impact versus the significance of effect. We'll be looking at MCA and the project appraisal balance sheet and the ranking of options. And as Bryn alluded to earlier in his presentations, I will be speaking quite a bit to professional judgment. I'll be making plenty of references to your cultural heritage data set. I'll also be speaking about proportionality as well. So lots of terms and terminology that you've encountered so far, and we'll delve a little bit deeper into it. So we all know that as cultural heritage professionals working on TII roadway and greenway schemes, we're obliged to identify and describe the direct and the indirect effects and significance of effect of the proposed project on cultural heritage. And we also have to document the methodology, the process, and the reasoning that we use to arrive at our opinions. And that's as an output, a required output of the project. But we have to bear in mind that because assessments can sometimes be subjective, it's also important for us to be very consistent in the application of methodologies. And that's where having methodologies set out in the guidelines to clearly spell out the significance of effect of the project in relation to cultural heritage is really important and very helpful for us. So the EIA directive, the 2014 directive, requires that all EIARs contain a description of the likely significant effects on the environment. But on TII projects, we need to consider all of the effects, not just the likely significant effects, which are both positive and negative, since we need to consider appropriate mitigation measures for cultural heritage receptors. But the proportionality is also important here. And our impact assessments should reflect the scope, the extent, the likely impacts of the proposed development, and should also reflect the importance and the sensitivity of the receiving cultural heritage environment. So in quite simplistic terms, and as shown on the slide that you're looking at, we can determine the significance of effect by looking at the importance of each of the cultural heritage receptors or assets within the project in relation to the magnitude of the impact that may occur. And we have to systematically assess what are the impacts. That is, what are the changes that are likely to happen, and what the effects, and by effects, I mean, what are the results of that change of a project, and what are they going to be on the cultural heritage environment. So using well-defined parameters, methodologies, and terminology in line with the guidelines and being consistent is really, really important in this regard. We should also be mindful that there is room for differences of opinion in predictions of the significance of effect, even though the assessments are carried out in a systematic way. And that's why the development of a robust cultural heritage data set is fundamental, and why clearly setting out the basis for our assessments is essential. Professional judgment can influence the significance of effect for specific receptors. So it's essential to have set out the basis for your professional judgment. Interactions, as Bryn has discussed already, interactions with other project team members and collaboration, including with the TII assigned project archaeologist, is also really important. And ultimately, it's very beneficial to the cultural heritage professional working on establishing the significance of effect for a project. So when we're assessing the significance of effect, all stages of the project need to be considered. That's from construction through to the operational and decommissioning phases where that's relevant. It's important for us to be consistent in the interpretation. And the guidelines provide us with the descriptions and the terminology to describe the significance of effect, ranging from imperceptible effects which are described as an effect capable of measurement but without significant consequences, all the way up to profound, which is an effect which obliterates a cultural heritage receptor of high or very high importance. Next slide there, Bryn, please. So this matrix that you're looking at on the screen now is adapted from the version we're all familiar with from the EPA 2022 guidelines, and it shows how the significance of effect is assessed. So on the left, you can see that in order to arrive at that significance of effect, it's necessary to rate the importance of the receptor, to describe the impacts or the effects, rate the magnitude or the level of the impact. And when these are considered, the significance of effect is arrived at. So why are the lines in the matrix wavy? That's because cultural heritage is not black and white, and because professional judgment has to be applied to the assessment. But let's take a closer look at importance and at the magnitude of the impact. And we might come back to this slide. So the importance of a cultural heritage receptor needs to be set out in order to work out what the significance of effect of a likely impact is going to be. That relies on professional judgment of the cultural heritage professional, and that judgment is going to be informed by the desktop research, the fieldwork, the surveys, the assessments, and the consultation that will have taken place throughout the option selection phases and into the environmental evaluation phase. Determining the importance throughout the process is subjective, it's iterative, and it can evolve as the project moves through the phases and stages and as new information becomes available. So that effectively means that during phases 2 to 3, the importance rating of a particular receptor can change. So say, for example, that at phase 2, a potential new archaeological site is identified through the analysis of aerial imagery. Its importance might be rated as low. However, if geophysical survey is undertaken during phase 3 to inform the EIAR, and the archaeological potential of the site is confirmed and the full extent of the site is shown, then the importance rating would be adjusted upwards to reflect all of the new information on that site. So the cultural heritage professional also needs to be familiar with and present the legislation, the regulatory and policy framework, the various treaties and the guidance that's used in their cultural heritage impact assessment. And all of these need to be taken into account during the process. But there will be previously unknown or previously unrecorded cultural heritage receptors that might not be protected by the legislation. And the cultural heritage professional needs to rate the importance of that receptor. So we have to set out the status or the designation of the receptor, but alongside that, professional judgment is used in considering that receptor on its own merits. And as shown in the slide you're looking at, the top tip here is that the legal status is just one of the criterion that's used for assessing importance. It shouldn't automatically be assumed that just because a receptor is a recorded monument, its importance should be rated as high. All of the merits of the receptor need to be considered in order to determine the importance. Included in those merits would be the intangible cultural heritage aspect of the receptor. There could be known local folklore relating to previously unrecorded receptors, which might be available via online sources like the Irish Folklore Commission's Schools Collection, or it could be captured as information presented by locals or landowners during public consultation. But that information is fed into your cultural heritage data set and becomes part of your CHIA assessment as the project moves through the phases. But again, proportionality is important here, and the level of research or work to identify all of the relevant aspects or merits of a receptor's importance will be commensurate with the stage and scale of the project, the likely impacts and the phase stage that you're working on. So the guidelines state that it's not necessary to evaluate the importance of all of the cultural heritage assets in the project study area unless they're likely to be impacted. So the slide that you're looking at now, taken from the guidelines, shows the typical criteria for assessing the importance of the receptor. But again, each receptor has to be assessed on its own merits. So other criteria might need to be added using your professional judgment. As mentioned previously, it's really important to set out the rationale for this in your assessment and process so that the importance of the receptor can be read and understood by the project team and wider readers of your assessment reports. And this is where having your robust cultural heritage data set from the outset is essential. And it's helpful to have fields for each of those criteria that are used for assessing importance in that data set. So you could have a field for the status, for the rarity, for the local interest, the condition or preservation of a receptor, as well as the fragility or vulnerability, etc. So there's 9 criteria typically used for assessing the importance presented in the guidelines. And there's the explanatory detail that you see there for each criterion to assist you in the process of assessment. For example, one of the criteria there is local interest of a receptor, and it's explained as being, while some receptors may not appear in any official listings or designations, they can be of importance to a dedicated interest group and or members of the local community. And that's also stated in the EPA guidelines. So very clearly necessary to include this sort of information in your cultural heritage data set and in the assessment of designated or undesignated receptors. Similarly, another of the criteria there for assessing importance is fragility or vulnerability of the receptor. And this involves understanding the level of threat to the receptor from erosion, from natural degradation, climate change, agricultural activity, land clearance, neglect, careless treatment, and or development. And all of these considerations will also help in the assessment of cumulative effects as well. So having each of the criteria set out as a field in your cultural heritage data set where you can apply your professional judgment is essential. And if you're defending your assessment at an oral hearing, having the rationale for your work set out in this way means that the supporting evidence for your conclusions is holistic and easily understood and accessible by both professionals and non-professionals who are looking at it. So in terms of rating the importance of receptors, guidelines use or suggest using a 5-point system, which ranges from negligible to low to medium to high and very high. And the images on the right of the slide loosely represent that scale, with World Heritage Property and National Monuments images at the top to previously unrecorded cultural heritage assets at the bottom. So the application of these 5 ratings are described in Table 5.6 of the guidelines. And for example, the negligible term there is described, it's appropriate to use for receptors or landscapes with very little surviving cultural heritage interest. Whereas a medium rating might be ascribed to recorded monuments, places or features of intangible heritage value, historic townscapes, or built up areas with demonstrable historic integrity in their buildings or settings, including public realms, street furniture, and other structures. The medium rating might also apply to historic landscapes of regional value. They could be designated or undesignated. And medium might be the appropriate rating for built heritage receptors recorded as being of regional importance by the NIAH, including the associated historic gardens and designed landscapes. So the suggested very high rating might include designated built heritage receptors of international importance, including their associated historic gardens and designed landscapes, or it could relate to World Heritage Properties and National Monuments or other designated receptors of international importance, for example. These suggested examples are not exhaustive, but as I mentioned, Table 5.6 sets out the guidance for assessing the importance of the receptors in the project assessments. But because assessments can be subjective and can be based on the experience and professional judgment of the cultural heritage professional, it's important to be consistent in the application of the methodologies and the terminology as set out in the guidelines to clearly spell out in plain English the significant effects of the project in relation to cultural heritage. We have to consider the predicted nature and the magnitude of the likely impacts and the known nature and assessed importance of the cultural heritage receptors in our projects. We have to understand and to analyse and describe the characteristics, the nature, the scale, and the impact of the project, and to update our project assessment information as we move through one phase to the next. And because that's an iterative process, there might be additional receptors added to the project through the design stages, and as the assessment becomes more focused and more detailed, investigations are carried out. And as the design develops, there can be both positive and negative effects on the same receptor, and these should be described and assessed separately. The assessment and the cultural heritage data set should include, as a minimum, the type of impact and effect, whether it's direct or indirect, the quality of the impact, the extent and the context of the impact or effect, the probability or the likelihood the identified effects will occur, the duration of the impact or effect, whether that's momentary, brief, temporary, short term, medium term, long term, permanent, or reversible, and the frequency of the impact or the effect. So will it occur once, rarely, daily, monthly, or constantly? So once the assessment has included all of that detail, it allows for us to assess the magnitude of the impact. And the magnitude depends on the nature, the scale, the duration, and the reversibility of the change that's envisaged and the location in which it could occur. So the criteria used to describe the assessment of the magnitude of impacts are ranked from negligible to low to medium to high. So very high might relate to them, might apply to a major alteration to or the complete loss of a cultural heritage receptor, and where the effects are likely to be large scale, permanent, and reversible. Whereas negligible might relate to imperceptible changes to a cultural heritage receptor. So once the importance of the receptor and the magnitude of the impact are established, then the EPA matrix or the graph for determining the significance of effect really comes into its own. So the EPA and TII provide terminology that's used to describe the significance of effect, which ranges from profound to very significant, moderate, slight, not significant, and all the way down to imperceptible. And for us, being consistent in the use of terminology is really important. And this terminology that's provided means that we're consistent with other environmental disciplines that are working across the project as well. So just looking at some of those terms there, we can see that profound effects would include those which would obliterate a cultural heritage receptor of high or very high importance, and where the magnitude of the impact has to be rated as very high in order to arrive at a profound rating for the significance of effect. Whereas a moderate effect is arrived at where the character of the cultural heritage receptor is altered, but in a manner which is consistent with existing or emerging baseline trends. The receptor would generally have to be assessed as being of medium importance with a medium magnitude of impact in order to arrive at a moderate significance of effect. But remember that your professional judgment is also built into the importance ratings there. So it's equally important then to provide that series of plain English statements to clearly explain the significant effects. And the example that's provided in the guidelines is a really neat one. It says that the construction of the proposed road will directly impact a well-preserved ring fort with upstanding banks and ditches. This impact will very likely result in the permanent loss of the monument, and as such, the magnitude of the cultural heritage impact is very high. This monument is of high importance and subject to statutory protection. Therefore, the cultural heritage effect is assessed as being profound and negative. So all of this information can be presented in an appendix and within the cultural heritage data set as well. And so on the screen there now, you see an example of how this might appear within an appendix. If your cultural heritage data set is robust from the outset, then this information can be filtered in your GIS CSV file or in an Excel table to generate the relevant information that's needed for that appendix that you see there. So this example shows selected fields which are commonly included in the cultural heritage data set, but in reality, your cultural heritage data set could have 30 or more fields, all with information that's pertinent to each individual receptor. But it's good to note that here, we have the assigned receptor number, the CH number, the type of receptor that we're dealing with, the approximate distance from a notional center line in this case, I think, and then the notes contain the assessment detail with professional judgment. And we're looking at, in this particular example, the effects for the construction phase. So again, remember that we're looking at the effects across all of the phases of the project for the environmental evaluation. And now we're going to take a little look at multi-criteria analysis, or MCA. It's another part of the assessment process for minor and major road schemes and for greenways. And also involved and related is the project appraisal balance sheet. That's MCA and PABS for short. So effectively, MCA is a tool that's used to integrate the detail from all of the environmental disciplines with the information that's derived from the economic and the engineering assessments. And when all of that data is combined, it allows for scoring of options against each other, and it allows for the identification of preferred option in line with the project objectives. So the MCA outputs feed into the development of the PABs in subsequent project phases. So the top tip here with this one is to be mindful of the scale of the project that you're dealing with, because projects with a value of less than 5 million will use a different appraisal process to, for example, a greenway project. So to find out the differences and which process to apply, you need to go to the appropriate TII project appraisal guidelines, which set out the process details for each. So when is MCA actually used in the assessments? So it's during phase 2 option selection, where there's actually 2 rounds of MCA that we need to complete. So the first round will be undertaken on the preliminary or the long list of options, and this will be a high-level assessment. And as the options are then refined or reduced, the second stage MCA will be undertaken, and that will be both a quantitative and a qualitative assessment in line with the methodology detail provided in your assessment method statement. And that method statement, as Bryn has already mentioned, has to be approved or signed off by the TII project archaeologist in advance of the commencement of the option selection phase, and in fact, in advance of the commencement of each of the phases for the project. So in the MCA, your receptors that are likely to be affected by the proposed project and the potential consequences of change to these, including the consideration of alternatives such as alternative routes and or alternative transport options, all have to be set out in line with the importance of each of the receptors. And you also have to record positive and negative effects for your MCA. And the results of that qualitative and quantitative analysis will feed into the project appraisal balance sheet for the preferred option arising out of the phase 2 option selection process. And it will be updated as the project moves along. So the PABs has to include a statement with a summary of the direct and indirect effects on cultural heritage, again, quantitative and qualitative detail, including your areas of archaeological potential and where the significance of effect is currently indeterminable, and taking into account any specialist survey reports that have informed the assessment. So again, the PABs has to be approved and signed off by the TII project archaeologist before it's submitted through the design team to the project manager for consideration. So the MCA and the option selection process requires us to use a ratings scale. And there is a suggested scoring scale in the guidelines. I think it's on your screen there now. But it is possible to adapt this or to adjust this in consultation with the TII project archaeologist, and to have set out the scale that's to be used in your method statement at the start of the phase, and that is to be approved in advance of the assessment. Now, again, something that Bryn had mentioned before and Ronan as well, it's not a numbers game. It's not necessary to place a numerical score for each individual receptor, because this leads to mathematical calculations with multiple variations, and it sometimes might attempt to shoehorn a scoring scale to fit cultural heritage receptors that have a multitude of varied characteristics. So instead, one single score is applied to each of your options that you're assessing, um, based on the methodology and the MCA and using your professional judgment. So this slide shows an example of a filtered cultural heritage data set with selected fields that show designated and undesignated receptors. And it shows how, again, this notional alignment would potentially affect those receptors. Again, this sort of table is easily produced and exported to your option selection report or appendix from an Excel file or from your CSV file from your GIS. And again, provided your cultural heritage data set is robust from the outset, the information is very easily generated. I'm not going to go through the detail for each one, each of the fields on the screen there, but I'm going to spend a bit more time on the next slide there, which shows a project appraisal matrix for cultural heritage that's developed as part of that phase 2 option selection process. So in this slide, you can see how the significance of effect and the quality of the impact is in the column on the left, using the consistent terminology as advised in the guidelines. You've considered using your professional judgment what the importance of the receptor and the magnitude of the impact is, and whether or not the likely resulting change will be positive or negative. And so in the columns to the right, then you can see you have each of your options that are being ranked, and the impact on each cultural heritage receptor is outlined against the various significance of effect categories there on the left. In this way, it's easy to quantify the number of impacts against the significance of effect to provide a purely numerical assessment. But ranking the assessment of options doesn't really end with that, because we all know that the option with the lowest number of predicted impacts might not necessarily be the preferred option from a cultural heritage perspective. So an option that has a profound effect on one cultural heritage receptor will probably be ranked lower in preference than an option that has several imperceptible effects. And that's why professional judgment has to be applied and why it needs to be clearly documented in the option selection process. It's also important to note that in the rankings table, you'll have those positives as well as negative effects, and they have to be clearly set out and they should be assessed and documented separately. So the lower table then at the bottom of the screen shows the assigned score that the cultural heritage professional gives to each option, with the preferred and the least preferred options for cultural heritage clearly shown. And we should note that this output is focused on the significant effects, that's the profound to significant ratings, and this is as per the EIA directive, which is where I started out in this section of the training, and it's where I'm going to wind up with this section as well. So that's it from me for the moment.
So we have just a comment in the questions from Richard Clutterbuck. Just to note, for flood relief schemes, the National Monument Service have advised that they require both a Section 12 notification and a Section 26 licence application or Section 14 consent. National Monument Services have agreed that the archaeological impact assessments carried out when planning the site investigations can be used as a Section 12 notification. And yeah.
And Ellen, just to follow up Richard's point there and the previous discussion, we're going to go back to NMS and just clarify to get a consistent approach across the schemes. I also noticed that there was a previous comment from Sarah McCutcheon, or from Sarah earlier on, around that consultation also is with local authority archaeologists, and that's an important point.
So let's move on to part 5 to geospatial data.
Thanks very much for coming along today, and for also to Joanne and Brent for those excellent presentations beforehand. This is going to be a short presentation, and it's going to focus on creating and using geospatial information as part of the Cultural Heritage Impact Assessment process. This is not going to be a technical GIS tutorial as such. Instead, we're going to look at an overview of hardware and software, mapping study areas using during the different phases of the cultural heritage process, mapping cultural heritage receptors, some basic geospatial analysis examples, things to consider, and the outputs, including the content figures and the geospatial elements of the cultural heritage data set. So we'll just move to the next slide here. Thanks, Brent. As I said, this is not a GIS or a CAD talk as such. It's just really a very brief rundown of the options for preparing geospatial analysis data and the outputs required in the guidance. The guidance was designed to be hardware and software agnostic. Different companies use different systems, and some projects may require a common data environment or standards to allow coordination amongst different disciplines and quality control. The hardware you choose, whether it's a PC, Mac, or Linux, needs to produce outputs that can be used by the other disciplines and the TII. Hardware may include tablets, phones, data loggers, or for fieldwork, and data collection, including vector data and photographs. While some cameras and most smartphones allow photographs to be geotagged. Hardware also needs to have the capability to handle the quantity of data and type of computations required. So if you're processing very large data sets, for example, working with point cloud or LiDAR data, you need hardware with the appropriate CPU, RAM, graphics card, storage, and software, and the software. The data requirements set out in this guidance may be accomplished using CAD or GIS, though in our experience, my experience anyway, GIS is most often most appropriate for assessment of large projects, basically because of its geospatial analysis capabilities. While some consultants may prefer to use CAD outputs for scheme drawings. There are also additional softwares for specialists analyzing LiDAR or geophysical survey data or photogrammetry. Brent already touched on that in his presentation. From the selection of logos in this slide here, you can see that there are multiple software applications which provide most of the capabilities required for geospatial requirements set out in the guidance. And these include both proprietary and open source softwares for both desktop work and for field work. I might just move to the next slide, please. So we're going to look at geospatial requirements for different phases of cultural heritage, of the cultural heritage impact assessment process. And these requirements will be set out in more detail in the assessment method statement prepared in advance of each phase. These assessment method statements should include details of the proposed geospatial analysis and data requirements appropriate to that phase, including, for example, the type of software to be used, the study areas and assessment corridors, the cultural heritage professionals carrying out the geospatial analysis, the range of geospatial data sources, the geometries of geospatial data appropriate for that phase, polygons, points, lines. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in the next few slides. The outputs required, including the content of the cultural heritage data set appropriate to that phase, and the range and content of figures to be outputted for that particular phase. There are certain geospatial requirements which are designed to facilitate the guidance aims, including recording cultural heritage receptors as polygons rather than points. And we're going to explain this a bit more in the next few slides. Just move to the next slide, bro. Thanks. So here's an illustration of how cultural heritage receptors may be mapped during phase 1 constraint study, where we have a very basic information about the project, a start and finish, and a study area around that. It's a very large study area with a range of cultural heritage receptors mapped based on information available from the SMR, zones of notification, NIH, protected structures, all these readily available sources that are already there to be used. And as Bryn said, it's appropriate at this stage of the works of the project to use those. We have recommended that receptors should be captured as polygons rather than points wherever possible and feasible to do so. But we know that this isn't always practical at phase 1. Some study areas may have hundreds of NIH sites, for example. The methodology for handling these should be set out in the assessment method statement. However, it should be noted that a single point will not effectively represent receptors that cover large areas, such as a design landscape or relic field system or a built heritage complex like a workhouse or something like that. And the methodology should account for how this is managed. For example, whether to generate polygons that are representative of these cultural heritage receptors. The cultural heritage receptors are best assessed as bounded areas, as I was saying, so polygons rather than points or lines. Where possible, when using existing polygons, like you can use existing polygons like the SMR zones of notification to define the boundary of a receptor. As you can see in the illustration there, as an example, CH11 in the illustration at the bottom. Where no existing boundary data is available, you can create a uniform area appropriate to that cultural heritage receptor type. Again, using the assessment method statement for the phase 1 constraint study to set this methodology out, and agreed with the project archaeologist before you start works. The constraint study should include the key cultural heritage receptors that are known to exist within or are intersected by the the constraint study area. And that's an example of CH12 in the bottom of the illustration there, which is intersected by the constraint study area. And this is an example of why it is useful to illustrate these as polygons rather than points. So if, for example, CH12 was a relic field system, the central point for that might be outside of the study area, but it actually does impinge, or the study area does impinge upon it. The guidelines provide detailed guidance on how to present and update geospatial data for cultural heritage receptors for each phase and stage of the cultural heritage impact assessment process, as well as mapping cultural heritage receptors identified through desktop research, fieldwork, and consultation. Might just move to the next slide, please, Bro. So for phase 2 option selection, our large study area has now been broken into several assessment corridors for the various route options being considered by the design team. These route options may be expressed as lines during phase 2, in which case the line can be used to create a polygon for the option corridor by generating a buffer for that line, extending to a total width of 500 meters or a buffer of 250 meters from the central. Again, this is something you would set out in the assessment method statement in advance of this phase of work. Additional cultural heritage receptors may be identified during phase 2, stage 1 to 3. For example, CH19 in the illustrations below. Cultural heritage receptors may also be linear, such as paths or canals or railways. For example, CH23 in the illustrations there. Again, these should also be expressed as polygons by an appropriate buffer from that line. And this will be refined as each of the phases are progressed. We get more detail about the actual extent of that receptor. And it's also worth noting that the cultural heritage receptors may be intersected by a number of different route options. The cultural heritage impact assessment will assess the impacts of the route option on cultural heritage receptors lying within each route option study area. The distance between the cultural heritage receptor and the route option should be measured as the shortest distance from the boundary of the receptor to the route option. For example, sorry, Ben, you might just go back to the previous slide there. For example, the boundary of CH13 is 120 meters from the center line of route option 4. CH15 intersects the route option 3 center line, so its distance is 0 meters. Additional cultural heritage receptors have been identified through fieldwork, specialist surveys and assessment, geophysical surveys or LiDAR analysis, for example. For this stage, importance ratings should be used to highlight areas of particular sensitivity. These importance ratings will need to be determined, will be needed to determine the significance of effect for an impacted receptor. And that's just speaking to the previous section that Joanne presented. So for phase 3 cultural heritage reports and chapters of the EIA or the EOR for Part 8 schemes, these will assess the likely impact of the project on all cultural heritage receptors within 250 meters of the development. However, the precise extent of areas assessed should have regard to the nature of the proposed scheme, as well as any significant setting or visual effects beyond this. Again, that's something that will be set out in the assessment method statement and agreed with the project archaeologist. As a rule, the study area for phase 3 will generally be based on the footprint of the proposed compulsory purchase order, or CPO area or land take, including all planned elements such as the intersections, attenuation ponds, access roads, quarries, construction compounds, and so on. All of these secondary developments are required to be included in the EIA under the EIA directive to ensure that the full impact of the project can be understood and addressed and adverse effects mitigated wherever possible. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about GIS to map receptors and measuring distances and assessing likely impacts. The elements of the assessment, including, let's say, the horizontal extent of cultural heritage receptors and the vertical extent as well, can be confirmed by fieldwork. The shortest distance between the development and the boundary of the receptor will be measured at this stage. For example, here CH4 in the drawings below is confirmed by fieldwork to be smaller than indicated during the phase 2 stage 1 assessment process. And is 40 meters from the development. So as Bryn and Joanne said, the process is iterative and we're constantly refining the assessment as we go along. Distances can be measured individually or using a particular algorithm within GIS if you want. But care should be taken to check, review, and verify these measurements, that these measurements are correct. Where developments intersect the cultural heritage receptor, in the illustrations below, these are areas highlighted yellow. The distance would be 0 meters. So for example, for CH9, 23, 27, and 28. Note also the developments may intersect cultural heritage receptors at more than one location, CH23, for example. It should be noted that geospatial analysis in GIS can sometimes throw up incorrect data or anomalous returns. So geospatial analysis outputs need to be visualized, validated, and checked through a quality control process in the same way that text outputs are. For example, care should be taken when using to use the correct GIS tools when calculating the center point coordinates of irregular receptor polygons to ensure that the coordinate is located inside the receptor. Just getting a centroid coordinate in this case may provide a coordinate located outside the footprint of the receptor. And this is something that I've found myself through my own work, that sometimes this can happen. It's worth keeping that in mind and checking when you're doing your analysis. Also, as the cultural heritage impact assessment process is iterative and the geospatial data is refined for each phase, be sure to update the details of your analysis text, including coordinates, areas, measurements at each phase of the process, So make sure that your cultural heritage data set is updated. Information on cultural heritage receptors within the project study area shall be compiled in the cultural heritage data set with associated mapping and geospatial data. The format for the cultural heritage data set outputs should be agreed with the project team and the project archaeologist as part of the assessment method statement for each phase. These may include geodatabases, geopackages, shapefiles, or DWG CAD drawings. With each type of vector layer format will have its strengths and weaknesses. But we would recommend that format which allows text to be included in the data set is best. So geodatabases, for example, geopackages. Shapefiles will also allow text, but only 255 characters. CAD generally only allows very little text within it. So, as I said, each have their strengths and weaknesses. It's something to be considered, and also to be considered with regard to the common data environment required by the technical advisor or the technical advisor or the environmental coordinator. So choose a format or formats of outputs that are fit for purpose, and set this out in the assessment method statement in advance so that it can be agreed. The suggested structure, format, and field names for the geospatial data in the cultural heritage dataset are provided in Appendix 5 of the guidelines. And these include unique IDs or a primary key for each row or entry in the geospatial dataset. That's assuming that you're using a geodatabase for your works, or some sort of database for your works. A receptor number, a unique receptor number, unique to each cultural heritage receptor, to be maintained throughout the process of the cultural heritage impact assessment. A receptor class and type, distance to options, the importance, receptor name, maybe recorded from historical maps or from local consultations. Central coordinates in ITM for the receptor. The place names, townland names, parish, barony, county, using the Teata Éireann National Place Names Gazetteer or Loganum Place Names Database of Ireland. Recorded archaeological or built heritage site numbers or designations. So for SMR, RMP, national monuments, sites subject to preservation orders, protected structures, NIH, REX, etc. It's worth noting that many of these are available as geospatial datasets, either from data.gov.ie, archaeology.ie, or local authorities. And Appendix 6 contains a list of information sources and repositories. Appendix 6 of the guidance document. For later phases of the cultural heritage impact assessment process, data added to the cultural heritage dataset may include boundary coordinates, character, magnitude of impact, sensitivity, significance of effect, quality of effect, mitigation type and details, and enhancement details. This detail can be agreed in the assessment method statement for the appropriate phase. In terms of graphic outputs for the maps and drawings, we have set out a number of basic details in the guidance. So we would expect that figures or drawings will contain the figure number and title, details of the scheme name, project details, legend, map source information, including the title, author, and publication date of historic maps used. The date and scale of the map that's just been created, or the drawing that's just been created, as a version control mechanism. And also just be careful with that the scale of the map matches the final production output of it as well. The map or drawing coordinate reference system should also be included in the drawing. And as I say, our preferences for Irish Transverse Mercator. Other details including north arrows, place names, including townland or street names, or national, regional, or local road numbers. We also recommend grid lines with coordinates and scale bars so that the maps can be scaled separately and located separately. We also recommend that an inset map is included, showing the location of that particular drawing in relation to the overall scheme. So again, these are suggested recommended additions to the visual outputs from the cultural heritage impact assessment process. And they really should be appropriate to the particular phase of the project as well. Not all this detail might be appropriate at certain phases or at certain scales of maps. And that's the sort of detail that we really recommend that you set out in your assessment method statement and agree with your TII project archaeologist in advance. If anybody has any particular questions about this, and again, bear in mind, this isn't a GIS tutorial, so sorry if it was particularly heavy on the GIS detail there, and I'll try to answer any specific questions I can here, and if I can't answer that question, we'll try to get back with a response to you later on by email.
Thanks, Richard. There's one question that's come in. So it's great to see polygons being used for heritage receptors, a welcome improvement on point data. Is there scope to refine the polygon extents for specific sites as the scheme proceeds and more details are known about a receptor? And secondly, do TII plan to share these polygons with National Monument Service for use on the HEV as a separate layer? Thanks.
I might answer the first part of that and let Ronan answer the second. The first part of that is there scope for refining the polygon extents? Absolutely. We would assume that it would be. Particularly at phase one, it's going to be very difficult to get the full extent of these cultural heritage receptors. So that's why I was saying that's, it's appropriate at that stage to be using existing outlines such as the zones of notification. But as you progress and as the assessment is refined, we would absolutely expect that the true extent of those receptors would either be reduced or extended or changed in shape. And that comes down to the professional judgment and the experience of the cultural heritage professional carrying out the assessment.
And then on the second part of the question, yeah, we'd be very happy to share with National Monuments the extents of the polygons and that data that falls into the principles of open government data.gov.ie, open data principles, I should say. So absolutely, and if National Monuments, if help National Monuments put for them to be able to put it online, that'd be great. But yeah, as Richard says, I'd agree that the polygons that polygons are much better than point data, but those polygons will change through the course of the project.
Great, thanks, Ronan. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a bit of a break there. There's a lot to take in. So we have a question via the email. I'll just read it out and Ronan can talk about it. So following a recent EIA case that went to judicial review, the High Court characterised the word significant as binary, i.e. an effect is significant or it is not. That was Monkstown Road Residents Association and versus On Board Planola. To that end, we are being asked by legal to determine what is significant in EIA terms versus what is not. We've been addressing this with a statement in the methodology to flag what level of effect is considered significant. So worth flagging as all the chapters go through legal review. Ronan might comment on that.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to actually pass this over to Bryn to start with, because obviously the question of significance was a major part of the development of the guidelines, and actually trying to put a little bit of a, shall we say, shape on what we understood to be. So, Bryn, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Yeah, no, look, it's an important point that's been raised there. Speaks of case law now, I suppose you could say. I mean, the TII guidelines were very much modelled on the EPA guidelines, as you know. And within the EPA guidelines, there's the various bands of significance of effect, which include significant, very significant, and profound. I'm just speaking from my own interpretation, from my own point of view on this. I would have thought it was reasonable to interpret anything that was significant, very significant, or profound as being captured within that overarching term, the legal term significant. Anything below that, not significant. But I think this is something that obviously can be addressed within the chapter itself, where you set that out. It's also something that can be set out in the assessment method statement in terms of how you approach this. But I suppose, making sure everything goes through legal is an important thing because we're not lawyers ourselves. So I hope that starts to answer the question, Ronan, if you want to pick up the thread there. But
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd also say is that, like I did have looked at Monkstown case, and there were particular exigencies there. But I think the key thing for all of us as, or everyone on the call, culture heritage practitioners, professionals, technical advisors, etc., is to make sure that we actually do capture all the culture heritage constraints, receptors that are being affected by our schemes in the EAR, and actually consider their impact and also consider significance. So we don't filter them out and ignore them. So long as we're capturing everything, we can then demonstrate to the competent authority, to the planning authority, that we're actually taking into account and not ignoring it. And I think that's a critical point.
yeah, and that's going beyond, I suppose, what's strictly required. I mean, I'm just thinking back to my own experience, in oral hearings, and I remember one of the barristers making it clear, not just to me as the cultural heritage person there, but all of the specialists in the room, was that your EIAR doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to capture all of the effects. I mean, what the EIA directive requires is that you capture the significant effects. And I suppose.
But what it says is that from a precautionary approach, if you document your effects that are there, and it can literally be in a table that's saying that these are documented and these are significant or not, at least you're actually, and we're using the scale that's in the guidelines, at least that is being able to demonstrate to the board that it has been documented and that has been considered to some extent. So I'm by no means am I suggesting that we should be going out writing reams and reams and reams about a site that is patently, not significant, but it does actually be able to help us to demonstrate that we have taken it on board.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. But I suppose the other thing that we all need to remember as well is that, and the EPA guidelines talks about this, is the importance of accessibility, that these documents, are easily understood by specialists and non-specialists. It's all about transparency. So we do need, and I think Joanne mentioned this in her piece, that we have to have those plain English statements, so, and this is where you highlight, well, these are the significant effects of this proposal. You can wrap that up in your, in your text. The significant effects are X, Y, Z. But that's that, and then attached to that and alongside that are all the other effects that have been considered. So we're not just, as you say, we're not just confining ourselves to those three, but it's essential, to meet the requirements of the directive, that we do identify those significant effects and then the measures to mitigate them.
And actually, just so that we don't drown out the significant effects by having 1,000, by obscuring them with all too much information.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I suppose it comes back to what Joanne was explaining to us, is and the importance of professional judgment and the importance of properly applying those bands of significance, particularly when you're getting up into the profounds. The profounds are reserved for the receptors that are of high and very high significance that are being impacted in a very high way. So it's about, and I suppose in that sense that there's maybe your binary sort of analysis. Is that the case, or is that isn't the case? Is it significant or isn't it significant? So if something is slight or moderate, I mean, my opinion would be that is not significant. My interpretation is that significant is significant, very significant, and profound. Those three are encapsulated in significant effects. But like I said, I mean, this is something that you would set out in your method statement, what your approach is. Other people on the call might have a different interpretation or a different approach to this. I think the key thing is that you lay out your methodology, your understanding, your definitions, and you work off that basis, following agreement from the PA and the PM.
Absolutely, and if you've got that done, you also have to make sure that it fits in with the design team as a whole, and actually that there's an agreement there with the design team as a whole, and that there's no surprises going back into design team at any point.
Absolutely, nobody likes surprises. Certainly not and it's also important as well to have consistency across the disciplines. You know, that we're not taking a profoundly different approach to all the other specialists.
Yeah.
Coordinated there.
Bryn?
I might just ask one if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks.
And it's going back to that EPA matrix for significance of effect, where obviously when you do your crossing the importance of the receptor with the magnitude of the impact, there is a range that you can arrive at within that sort of block within the graph, which can go from medium verging in towards the high significance or significance of effect. So is there potential for us in our assessments to actually present a range for the significance of effect rather than just one single call on it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have seen that done.
Yeah.
You know, so I have seen that done, and you know, with a lot of this, and this is the other thing about archaeology, I suppose, in particular, it's not until you actually hit construction that you fully understand the significance. So, for example, I mean, we're doing stage 1 testing down in Foynes at the moment, you know, and like anyone else on the call who works for an archaeology company or is an archaeologist, you know, you only fully start to understand, you know, the full importance or significance or extent and the nature and so on of subsurface archaeology when you know, put the spade in the ground, so, and excavate it and all the rest of it. So I suppose, you know, having that range allows. Now that's not very helpful, I suppose, for the approvals process, but that's unfortunately that is the reality. That is the nature of the beast, you know. So, but I have seen those ranges put forward in cultural heritage chapters.
Yeah, Joanne, I haven't actually seen that range being used, and I think that there is a case that at a particular point in time, you're making your best professional judgment as to the significance of effect of a particular site. I'd also be concerned about ranges being too broad. Like there is like we all know that archaeology, and particularly subsurface archaeology, we're not going to know the true significance till it's the excavation, and we may not know the true significance till the excavation is complete and the post excavation is done. So we don't want to kind of default back into an area of saying it may be significant or may not be significant. I don't think that's particularly helpful for the planning authority to make a decision. So I do think that at any point in time we have to be able to come to a decision in a reasoned sense based on the information at hand at that particular point in time to say this is where we've come from. And be prepared that sometimes our understanding of the site and our understanding of the significance of effect is going to go up and go down. Like I would expect through a process of so we will gain more information. But equally, we all know, say, on the Historic Environment Viewer and the RMP, you have redundant records. So by definition, we know that sites can start off being considered significant, and then as information is received, that significance changes through time. And I think that's another piece there.
I suppose in assistance with it then as well is that collaborative piece with the TII assigned project archaeologists, so that you can, I mean, ultimately it's about trying to reduce or avoid the kind of the indeterminable aspect of the significance of effect determination. So that's, you know, part of what is very helpful is to actually have that collaboration as well. Avoid those ranges.
Thanks, guys. We have a question from Yolanda there. She has her hand up. If you want to speak.
Hi. I just want to ask about Richard's comment that geodatabases are preferable to shapefiles because of the amount of text that you can add to it. And I've spoken to Richard before about this, but I found myself reverting back to using shapefiles for some projects because not everyone that I submit a geodatabase to has the ability to read and use it. So are TII happy enough to accept geodatabases as it's a proprietary format?
I might just speak to what I was trying to say there. How you land that's actually a very good point. We see the same ourselves. That some consultancy just can't handle that information, and that's the sort of thing that you probably should be worked out in the assessment method statement to begin with, and agreed with the technical advisor and the environmental coordinator. and in conjunction with the common data environment as well. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, from our perspective of using geodatabases, they are incredibly useful. But in terms of outputs going to the other disciplines, they may not be able to handle them. So I think that's a reasonable point. Um, I don't know that TII are necessarily going to set out a prescribed, this is what you need to do, the data that you need to produce for this particular for this particular project. That's probably best set out and agreed with the project archaeologist in the assessment method statement.
I'll pick that up, Richard, and thanks, Yolanda. That decision around the exact data types, etc., will be very much part of the project team environment, and we haven't gone into the governance of projects whereby TI is approving authority, local authority as the client, and so on. So it's going to be done at the level of the project team. So you're going to have the technical advisor, local authority, TI, project archaeologists, etc., involved, and that's where those sort of decisions around what are acceptable or unacceptable data types.
Now, there's a question in the chat. There's a limited understanding and use of geoarchaeology in the commercial archaeological sector in Ireland compared to the UK. CPD in it would be useful. That's something that I'm working on the paleo-environmental update and review, and we are including a small section on geoarchaeology. And we did, as part of the Environmental Archaeology in Ireland group, we did run a CPD with the IAI 2 years ago, and we did include geoarchaeology in that CPD, but it is something that we are trying to increase awareness of and push forward a little bit. So that's might help. If anybody else wants to come in there, there is a very good English Heritage or Historic England have very good guidance on geoarchaeology in commercial archaeology as well. If anybody wanted to look at that, those guidelines.
Yeah, I definitely think another session on the geoarchaeology and CPD would be a really good one. But I think that's be captured partly in the paleoenvironmental and then in the II CPD.
Yeah, and we will be running one on the 25th of April. The IAI are going to be running another environmental sampling guidance day, CPD day, if anybody wants to attend. That's the 25th of April, Friday the 25th of April in UCD, and we will be covering geoarchaeology. So the next question is, can you advise on assigning a value for potential archaeology that has not been subject to site investigation during the assessment phases?
Well, I might kick it off again, but maybe Joanne might jump in.
Thanks, Bryn.
If you don't mind, Joanne. Yeah, look, I mean, this was a conundrum, not everything is fully known unless you assess it. I mean, I think we already have talked about LiDAR features and geophysical anomalies and so on, and until you actually put a trench through it, you're not necessarily going to know if you're even dealing with archaeology. So, these unknowns exist, in terms of how you rate it, I suppose, what you have to do is go with the best information you have at the time and your professional judgment. But it will have to be a preliminary assessment until it's fully determined. But Joanne, you might want to jump in here, but it does kind of speak to the importance of trying to understand as much as you can and doing as much advanced testing as possible before you go to approval. And that's why those phase 2 and phase 3 works do provide opportunities to go in and undertake test trenching.
Yeah, so for example, this is where I was kind of alluding in my talk to, if you're working on a phase 2 options assessment and you, through aerial photography, might identify a circular anomaly, let's say it might be a ring ditch, or you're interpreting it as a ring ditch, and then you look at the rest of the data set around and you see that you have, multiple other ring ditches in that area as well, then chances are, you're probably going to be dealing with a ring ditch. Now, you can't confirm it until you do that further assessment, but using your professional judgment, you can, I think, effectively assign a rating to it. I, in that instance, would not be inclined to assign a low importance to it, you know, because you're in an area of known archaeology with very similar features. So I think this is again where your professional judgment is going to kick in for sure.
Yeah, I'd support both John there. I think the other thing is that we're also, if we look at the sort of range techniques that we're bringing to bear on these potential sites, you're seeing LiDAR, you're seeing geophys, you're seeing field walking, you're seeing, like, we haven't gone into depth, say, cartographic regression and analysis, and referring to, I don't know, bring your tongue, the OS maps, the bog maps, etc. There's a huge amount of work that we're bringing to bear that can help to inform our judgment as professional archaeologists and cultural professionals.
I was just saying, now might be just an opportunity just to just let people know that if they do think of questions when the meeting is finished, something might occur to you later on. Don't be afraid to email us, contact us over the next few weeks, and we'll come back with our answers. Yeah.
There's an observation in from Mary Deavy. Another professional judgment issue that would be captured in the assessment method statements on schemes with highly sensitive CHR. It may be appropriate for techniques to be carried out at an earlier phase. That's great. I'll just say thanks to everybody for participating. It's been really informative morning. Lots to think about. Just thanks from the Institute of Archaeologists of Ireland, and we have the recording, and when it's ready to send out, we'll send it out. And I'm also going to send out a PDF of today's talk where after the talk is over today. So you'll get a PDF of all the slides. So thanks everybody, and I'll just let Ronan have the last word.
Thanks, Ellen. First off, thank you very much to everyone for coming along today. It's great. We've got a good sustained participation from all the attendees. As I said, we're very happy to take on any comments later on. You can also go to infopubs.ti.ie for more information. Finish up, I'd just like to thank Ellen, Niamh, and I for facilitating today's session. We really value the collaboration in TI that we have with II. It's great institute, and I think there's a lot of good work coming out there. Also have to thank Bryn, Joanne, Richard, and all the AMS team, not only for the work today, but also the work over the past couple of years in actually developing the guidelines. It's taken a lot of work to do, get them across the line. There's been quite a few changes along the way in terms of new legislation coming in and so on, and really appreciate all of that. Also, I thank all my colleagues at TI, Michael, Stanley, James Ogan in particular, but also the wider TI team, both within archaeology and heritage and also beyond archaeology and heritage. And, that was absolutely essential to develop the guidelines of successful use. And finally, thanks to everyone here for attending, for participating, and for feeding information. So enjoy the rest of the day.